Man, let me tell y'all about Gwen Guthrie. She was bold, she was fearless, and she gave us one of the rawest anthems of the 80s ain't nothing going on but the rent. You know that line, no romance without finance. It hit like a truth bomb, and it still gets quoted today. But here's the crazy part. While her song lived on, her name started fading out of the spotlight. Wow, that's wild, right? A powerhouse voice, a songwriter for legends, a queen of the club scene, yet the industry barely gave her flowers. Why did someone who shaped the sound of a generation get left in the shadows? Let's get into her story right now. Let me know where you're watching this from in the comments. Grab yourself a warm drink, maybe a cup of water or tea, sit back, and let's start this journey together. All right, y'all, let's take it back to the beginning, because every legend's story starts somewhere humble. Gwen Guthrie came into this world on the 9th of July, 1950, born and raised in Newark, New Jersey. And let me tell you, Newark in those days wasn't some easy breezy playground. It was a working-class city, full of hustle, grit, and people just trying to survive. The streets were alive with gospel, soul, and the early stirrings of rhythm and blues that would define a generation. Gwen soaked all of that in like a sponge. Now picture this little Gwen in church, surrounded by voices lifting the roof with hymns. That's where she first found her power. Gospel music wasn't just a pastime, it was her foundation. You know how folks say the church raised some of the greatest soul singers ever? Gwen was one of them. She learned not just how to sing, but how to feel every single note. That voice of hers didn't come from some vocal coach. It came from spirit, from the choir, from Sunday mornings where the music could make you cry, shout, or heal, right on the spot. Growing up, Gwen wasn't some privileged kid with music lessons and fancy instruments. Nah, man, she had to fight for her lane. Her family was modest, but they encouraged her gift. By the time she was a teenager, Gwen was already scribbling down lyrics and experimenting with melodies, dreaming of a bigger world beyond the city blocks. That hunger, that drive it was written in her DNA. And here's the thing about Newark. It was close to New York City, the mecca of music. So while Gwen was sharpening her craft locally, she was only a train ride away from the center of the universe for soul, R&B, and eventually disco. That proximity meant opportunity, but also competition. To stand out, you had to be undeniable. And Gwen, she was undeniable. Her early inspirations came from listening to the greats Aretha Franklin, Gladys Knight, Nina Simone. But Gwen wasn't out here trying to copy them. She studied them, sure, but she wanted to bring her own flavor. Friends would later recall how she was always singing, always writing, always hustling to turn her voice into her ticket. She wasn't just a dreamer, she was a doer. By the late teenage years, Gwen was already moving in local circles, performing at small gigs, church functions, and anywhere she could grab a mic. She didn't care if it was 50 people or 5 people when she sang, she made it count. Her voice had that rare combination of grit and sweetness, toughness and vulnerability. Even back then, people would stop and say, "Whoa, this girl got something special." But talent alone wasn't enough. This was still a world where young black women had to fight twice as hard just to get heard. Gwen faced all that: the doubts, the doors closed in her face, the industry folks who didn't see her shine yet. Still, she didn't give up. Instead, she doubled down on her songwriting. Writing became her secret weapon. If she couldn't kick down the door as a singer right away, she was gonna slip in as a writer. And trust me, that pen of hers was sharp. What's wild is that Gwen wasn't just writing about love in the sweet, cliché way. Nah, she was putting real life into those lyrics. Her early sketches already carried themes of independence, empowerment, and calling things out the way they really were. She wasn't afraid to say what was on her mind, and that honesty would later define her biggest hit. By the early 70s, Gwen had carved out a reputation as a young talent with both a voice and a pen. Word was spreading through the local scenes. This girl could sing, this girl could write, and she wasn't playing around. Newark may have been her starting ground, but she had her eyes on New York, and New York was waiting for her. Looking back, it's clear that Gwen's early life shaped everything about her artistry. The church gave her soul. Newark gave her grit. The times gave her something to push against. She wasn't polished in some music school. She was raw, she was real, and she was ready. And you know what? That rawness is what made her unforgettable once she finally got her shot. So by the time Gwen Guthrie stepped into the professional music world, She wasn't some overnight success. She was years in the making. Every lyric she wrote, every hymn she sang, every little gig she hustled built her into the powerhouse she'd soon become. From Newark's pews to New York's stages, Gwen was on her way. All right, y'all, so once Gwen started stepping out of Newark and into the bigger world of music, that's when things really started heating up. She wasn't just some singer waiting for a big break, she became the go-to background vocalist in New York. And let me tell you, in that era, being a background singer was no joke. That was the training ground, the place where real voices were tested, sharpened, and respected. Man, Gwen's voice could blend with anybody, but it could also stand out when needed. That balance made her a favorite for producers. She sang behind the Queen of Soul herself, Aretha Franklin. Yeah, think about that. You gotta be tough to stand in Aretha's shadow and still hold your own. Gwen did that. She also worked with Billy Joel, Stevie Wonder, Sister Sledge, and even Madonna when Madonna was just getting started. You know how wild that is? Gwen was literally part of the DNA of other people's hits. But here's the twist. Gwen wasn't content with being in the background. Nah, she had a bigger vision. While she was stacking sessions, she was also writing. And her pen game? Whew, sharp as a knife. She co-wrote Supernatural Thing for Ben E. King, and that song became a smash. You know how big that was? That was a #1 R&B hit in 1975, climbing all the way up the charts, blasting out of radios, shaking dance floors, and right there, behind that success, was Gwen Guthrie's pen. That's the part people forget, man. Gwen wasn't just a singer, she was a songwriter. And writing gave her leverage in an industry that didn't always treat women, especially black women, with the respect they deserved. Every lyric she wrote was like another brick in the foundation of her legacy. Now imagine this. You're in the studio, working with giants, your songs are getting cut, your voice is everywhere, but your name? Still in the shadows. That's where Gwen was. She had all the tools, all the talent, but the industry wasn't shining the light on her yet. And that's the crazy, underrated part of her story. She was literally shaping the sound of the mid-70s, but most people didn't even know her face. Still, Gwen wasn't discouraged. If anything, it fueled her. She was building connections, getting respect from the musicians and producers who knew the real deal. Behind closed doors, everybody in the business knew Gwen was special. It was only a matter of time before the rest of the world caught up. So, by the late '70s, Gwen Guthrie wasn't some rookie anymore. She had the receipts, hit records written, sessions sung, and her name circulating in the inner circles of New York's music scene. The foundation was set. And y'all know what happens when a star is ready? The breakthrough is coming. By the time the late '70s rolled around, Gwen Guthrie was ready to step out from the shadows. All those years, singing background and penning songs had built her confidence, her connections, and her sound. So when the chance came to put her name on the front of the record, she didn't hesitate. Man, Gwen was about to let the world know who she really was. Her first solo efforts came in the early '80s. She signed with Island Records, the same label that had Bob Marley, Grace Jones, and a roster full of artists who weren't afraid to break rules. That fit Gwen perfectly. She wasn't a cookie-cutter artist. She had her own edge. Her debut album dropped in 1982, and while it didn't blow the doors off the charts, it announced her arrival. Songs like It Should Have Been You gave her that first taste of attention. In fact, that track became a club favorite, especially in the UK, where DJs were spinning it heavy. And here's the thing, Gwen wasn't just making R&B records. She was living in the club scene, breathing that energy, and it showed in her music. House, disco, funk, R&B, she blended all of it. New York's underground embraced her before the mainstream even knew what was going on. DJs like Larry Levan at Paradise Garage were picking up her records and turning them into anthems. When your song gets the garage seal of approval, that's like being knighted in the dance world. Now, Gwen had this gift. She could make songs that spoke to the head and the heart. They had groove, but they also had message. It Should Have Been You wasn't just some dance floor filler. It was a real story about heartbreak and self-worth. That combination made her stand out. She wasn't just chasing a trend, she was bringing truth to the dance floor. Her follow-up projects built on that momentum. By 1983 and 1984, Gwen was dropping singles and albums that got her noticed across the Atlantic and in the States. Tracks like Peanut Butter and Hopscotch started circulating, showing her playful but sharp songwriting. And in the clubs, records like Padlock, produced with the Compass Point All-Stars, were straight-up classics. If you were at the Garage or Zanzibar, you know those joints had the crowd sweating, singing, and losing themselves in the groove. What's wild is that while she was building this club reputation, the industry still didn't push her like they should have. She wasn't getting the massive promo budgets or the primetime spotlight, but her name was ringing out where it mattered on the dance floors, in the studios, among real music heads. And slowly, the buzz was turning into a roar. By the mid-'80s, Gwen Guthrie was no longer just the background singer or the songwriter for hire. She was carving her own lane, proving she had the chops to stand on her own. The clubs were behind her, the UK was embracing her, and the US was finally starting to pay attention. The stage was set for her to drop the song that would define her career. All right, y'all, this is the moment where Gwen Guthrie stamped her name into history. By 1986, after grinding in the background and proving herself in the clubs, Gwen dropped the track that would define her career, her message, and her whole vibe. Ain't nothing going on but the rent. Man, let me tell you, when that joint hit, it wasn't just a song, it was a statement. That line, "No romance without finance," wasn't just catchy, it was straight up revolutionary. Gwen was laying down the truth that so many women had felt, but didn't always say out loud. She was flipping the script on relationships, saying love is cool, but security, stability, and respect matter too. And wow, people either loved it or they couldn't handle it. The track was bold, funky, and in your face. It had that bounce that made you want to dance, but the lyrics, they cut deep. Some folks called it gold digging, others called it empowerment. But either way, everybody was talking about it. That's how you know you've made an impact. The song shot up the charts, reaching #1 on the Billboard R&B chart. For Gwen, that was vindication proof that her voice and her message had power. And you know what's wild? Ain't Nothing Going On But the Rent didn't just stop in 1986. It became one of those cultural touchstones. Eddie Murphy even joked about it in his comedy special Raw. Years later, artists like Foxy Brown sampled it with Mia on her China Doll album. And you can feel its DNA in tracks like TLC's No Scrubs or Destiny's Child's Bills, Bills, Bills. Gwen set the blueprint for anthems that demanded respect and flipped the power dynamic in relationships. Now let's talk about the reaction in the clubs. When DJs dropped that record, man, the dance floor erupted. Folks were chanting the hook, pointing fingers, laughing, and singing it like it was their personal theme song. For women, it was empowerment. For men, it was a wake-up call. Either way, Gwen had everybody paying attention. But here's the underrated part. Even with a smash hit, the industry still didn't treat her like the superstar she deserved to be. She didn't get the same mainstream push as some of her peers. While Whitney Houston was blowing up pop charts and Janet Jackson was running MTV, Gwen was more underground, more cult following than household name. And that's the injustice right there. She gave us an anthem that lived forever, but the industry didn't crown her the way they should have. Still, Gwen wasn't fazed. She doubled down on her truth. She knew she had tapped into something bigger than just a radio hit. She was speaking to people's real lives. That honesty, that sass, that fire, that's what made Gwen Guthrie unforgettable. So when we look back at the mid-'80s, Ain't Nothing Going On But the Rent wasn't just her breakthrough, it was her declaration. She went from being known in clubs and studios to being stamped into pop culture forever. The anthem was hers, the message was hers, and the legacy? Yeah, that was hers too. Now here's the thing, man, Gwen wasn't a one-song wonder. After Ain't Nothing Going On But the Rent blew up, people started digging deeper into her catalog. And what they found? Straight gems. Songs like Padlock, Seventh Heaven, and Outside in the Rain became legendary in their own right, especially in the club scene. Let's start with Padlock. That joint was produced with the Compass Point All-Stars down in the Bahamas, the same crew that worked with Grace Jones. Man, the groove on that track was undeniable. Larry Levan, the iconic DJ from Paradise Garage, took that record and turned it into a straight-up anthem. When he spun Padlock, the crowd lost their minds. To this day, clubheads still talk about how Gwen's voice just floated over that beat, locking people in like the song's title itself. Then you got Seventh Heaven, That record wasn't just music, it was an experience. It was played heavy at the Garage, Danceteria, and Palladium, the epicenters of New York nightlife. Gwen's voice on that track carried this spiritual energy, like she was taking you somewhere higher while the bass line kept you grounded on the dance floor. DJs loved it, dancers lived for it, and Gwen became a goddess in the underground. And don't sleep on Outside in the Rain. That one showed her versatility. It wasn't just a club banger, it was tender, emotional, soaked in vulnerability. Gwen could hit you with empowerment one moment and then pull at your heart the next. That balance is rare, man. She wasn't just a dance artist, she was a storyteller. What's crazy is that in the 80 club world, Gwen Guthrie was royalty. Her records were the soundtrack to countless nights, countless memories. For many people who went to the Garage or Zanzibar, hearing Gwen was like a ritual. She gave them joy, healing, and freedom in those spaces. And that's something mainstream charts could never measure. But here's the kicker. Even with all these club classics, Gwen was still underrated. The radio gave her one huge hit, but the deeper gems never got the spotlight they deserved. Critics sometimes boxed her in as just a dance act, ignoring the depth of her songwriting and the power of her voice. That's the tragedy of it. The clubs crowned her, the fans adored her, but the industry never fully got behind her. Still, Gwen's breakthrough wasn't just about one record or one moment. It was about carving out a lane where she could be fully herself, bold, soulful, and unapologetic. She gave the world music that made you move, made you think, and made you feel. And in the process, she built a legacy that stretched way beyond the charts. Now, man, as high as Gwen's star was rising in the mid-'80s, the truth is the industry didn't always play fair. That's the heartbreaking, underrated part of her journey. She had the hits, she had the voice, she had the pen, but the machine. It never fully pushed her the way it should have. Let's be real, the music business in that era was brutal, especially for black women. The spotlight was crowded with powerhouse voices like Whitney Houston, Anita Baker, Stephanie Mills, Chaka Khan, and instead of building Gwen up alongside them, labels often treated her like she was niche or too club. That's crazy, right? Because the same songs tearing up Paradise Garage and Zanzibar could have been global smashes with the right push. Another struggle? Money. The industry loves to profit off talent but doesn't always reward the talent. Gwen, like many artists of her time, didn't see the kind of financial stability that matched her influence. Ain't Nothing Going On But the Rent was literally a song about needing security, and in some ways, it reflected her reality. She saw how unstable the business could be. One day you're hot, the next you're struggling to keep momentum. And don't forget the critics. Some of them dismissed her as a dance act or said her message was too blunt. Man, imagine that. In a world where women's voices were often watered down to love ballads, Gwen had the audacity to speak truth about money, respect, and independence. Instead of celebrating her honesty, some critics painted her as controversial. That label stuck and sometimes kept radio programmers and executives from giving her the shine she earned. Even on a personal level, the grind was tough. Long nights in the studio, constant travel, performing, fighting to be heard, it wears on you. And unlike some of her peers who had massive management machines behind them, Gwen often had to navigate the chaos on her own terms. She wasn't built to play the game in a fake way, she wanted to stay true. But staying true in that business sometimes meant missing out on the big commercial moves. And here's the cruel irony. The very things that made Gwen brilliant, her independence, her rawness, her club roots, were the things the mainstream industry used against her. They boxed her in, instead of realizing she was ahead of her time. Today, artists get praised for mixing house, soul, and empowerment lyrics. Back then, Gwen was pioneering it, but the industry wasn't ready to give her flowers. So yeah, while Gwen was still making moves, the cracks in the system were showing. She had to carry the weight of being underrated, overlooked, and underappreciated, even while fans and club-goers treated her like a queen. That tug-of-war, loved by the people, ignored by the business, was the conflict that followed her career. As the 80s moved into the 90s, Gwen Guthrie faced her toughest battles yet, and this time, it wasn't just the industry. It was personal, man. Behind the smile, behind the voice that could light up a room, Gwen was dealing with health issues that few knew about. She was diagnosed with uterine cancer, a fight that would eventually claim her life. Think about that, a woman who gave so much energy, so much fire on stage, was privately carrying this heavy burden. And like many artists of her generation, she didn't always have the resources, the medical support, or the industry safety net to fall back on. That's the dark side of fame, y'all. People see the glitter but not the struggle behind it. Gwen kept performing as long as she could. She didn't want to let her fans down, and the stage was her sanctuary. But the toll on her body was real. By the mid-90s, her appearances had slowed down, and whispers started spreading about her health. Fans who saw her live in those later years recall how she still gave her all, even when you could tell she was pushing through pain. That's courage, man. That's love for the craft. And then came the tragedy. On the 3rd of February 1999, Gwen Guthrie passed away in her hometown of Newark at just 48 years old. Gone way too soon. Think about it, 48. That's barely halfway through life. She should have had decades more to create, to inspire, to teach. Instead, the world lost her voice while it was still so powerful. The reaction from fans was heartbreak mixed with disbelief. For a lot of people, Gwen wasn't just another singer, she was the soundtrack to their youth, to their club nights, to their moments of empowerment. Her death felt personal, yet the mainstream media barely covered it. That's the underrated story right there. A woman who shaped the sound of an era, gone too soon, and the industry barely said her name. And here's what stings even more. Gwen passed away less than 2 weeks before rapper Big L was killed. Fans often point out how both losses, one from health, one from violence, hit back to back, and yet neither got the coverage they deserved. It's like the culture felt the pain, but the industry turned its head. When you look at her struggles, the financial challenges, the lack of recognition, the health battle, it paints a picture of an artist who carried so much weight without ever fully being celebrated. Gwen Guthrie deserved more. She deserved her flowers while she was here. And that's why we gotta tell her story now, because silence is the biggest injustice of all. Now here's the beautiful part of Gwen Guthrie's story. Man, even though the industry didn't always give her the shine she deserved while she was here, her music kept echoing long after she was gone. That's what real legacy is about. Let's start with the anthem. Ain't Nothing Going On But the Rent didn't just stay in 1986. That hook, that line, that energy it lived on. Foxy Brown and Mia flipped it for Job on the China Doll album in 1999. And you can hear its DNA in TLC's No Scrubs in 1999, or Destiny's Child's Bills, Bills, Bills that same year. Those songs became empowerment anthems for a new generation, but the seed, that came straight from Gwen Guthrie. She lit the torch. And it wasn't just about lyrics. Gwen's blend of R&B, funk, disco, and early house music put her at the forefront of a movement that would explode years later. Today, when you listen to house divas or soulful house records, you hear Gwen's fingerprints. Tracks like Padlock and Seventh Heaven are still staples for DJs, sampled, remixed, and celebrated worldwide. Larry Levin made sure those songs would never die, and modern DJs continue the tradition. Her voice also lived in unexpected places. She sang background on Madonna's early work, and you know how massive Madonna became. Gwen's harmonies, her tone, her texture helped shape pop history, even when her name wasn't on the marquee. That's the underrated reality you've been hearing Gwen Guthrie for decades, even if you didn't always know it. Songwriters and artists who came after her often echoed her approach. Gwen wasn't afraid to be direct, to inject real talk into her music. That influenced countless women in R&B who pushed beyond cliches and sang about independence, money, self-worth, and respect. From Mary J. Blige to Beyoncé, that line of unapologetic honesty has Gwen's spirit in it. And fans? Man, they never forgot. Ask anybody who was at Paradise Garage or Zanzibar, and they'll tell you Gwen's records were part of the soundtrack of their lives. For them, Gwen wasn't underrated, she was legendary. She gave them freedom on the dance floor, a voice that matched the highs and lows of life. That kind of connection? It can't be erased by industry charts. Even today, younger listeners stumble on her records through samples, playlists, or a random club remix, and they're like, who is this voice? Then they discover Gwen Guthrie, and a whole world opens up. That's legacy, man. That's timeless. So while Gwen may not have gotten all her flowers in her lifetime, the impact of her music on culture, on women's empowerment, on the very sound of R&B and house, is undeniable. She planted seeds that grew into forests. And every time somebody quotes, "No romance without finance," whether they know it or not, they're carrying Gwen's truth forward. Now let's talk about the rediscovery of Gwen Guthrie. Because here's the truth. Man legends never really disappear. They just wait for the world to catch back up. In the years after her passing, DJs kept Gwen alive on the dance floor. Tracks like Padlock and Seventh Heaven became sacred records in underground sets. Larry Levan may have been the first to crown her as a garage queen, but generations of DJs after him carried that same torch. Whether it was a remix in London, a set in Ibiza, or a house party in Chicago, Gwen's voice was still floating through the speakers, making people dance, sweat, and feel alive. That's eternal. And you can't overlook the role of the internet in streaming. When platforms started resurfacing catalog cuts, younger listeners who had never stepped foot in a disco found Gwen. They'd hear "Outside in the Rain" or "It Should Have Been You" on a playlist and suddenly realize, wait, this is fire. Social media turned quotes like "No romance without finance" into memes, keeping her words fresh in a new digital generation. Gwen went from vinyl crates to viral posts. That's how strong her voice still is. Her legacy also shows up in conversations about female empowerment. Long before it was mainstream to sing about independence, Gwen made it her calling card. She demanded respect in love, in money, in life, and that's a message that never expires. You hear that same attitude in today's artists who dominate R&B and pop with unapologetic truths. They might not always name-drop Gwen, but her influence is living in their song. And here's something beautiful. Fans themselves became the keepers of her flame. On forums, YouTube comments, tribute posts, people share their memories of seeing Gwen live, of dancing to her records, of being inspired by her strength. That community remembrance is powerful. It's like a second life, built from love. So when we talk about Gwen Guthrie's legacy, it's not just about chart positions or awards, it's about impact. It's about the club kids who found freedom in her music, the women who found strength in her lyrics, and the younger generations who continue to rediscover her voice. Gwen may not have been crowned a superstar by the industry, but in the hearts of those who know, she's royalty. And that's what makes her story so underrated, yet so everlasting. So here we are, man. We've walked through the life of Gwen Guthrie from her early days in Newark, to writing hits for legends, to owning the club scene, to dropping one of the most unforgettable anthems of the '80s. And yet, despite all of that, she still sits in that space we call underrated. That's the bittersweet truth of her story. Think about it. Gwen gave us "Ain't Nothin' Goin' On But the Rent," a record that still gets quoted, sampled, and celebrated decades later. She gave us Padlock, Seventh Heaven, It Should Have Been You, and Outside in the Rain. She gave her voice to the background of stars like Aretha Franklin, Billy Joel, Stevie Wonder, and Madonna. And her pen? That created Supernatural Thing for Ben E. King, a record that rocked the mid-'70s. This woman's fingerprints are all over music history, yet too often her name gets left out of the conversation. And that's the part that hits hard, y'all. Gwen didn't just sing songs, she shifted culture. She spoke truths that others were too scared to put on wax. She stood on stages and told the world that respect, independence, and honesty mattered. For women, for fans, for anyone living through the hustle of life, she was a voice of reality. That's why people still remember her, still play her, still love her. But the industry? Man, they didn't give her the flowers she earned. She wasn't pushed the way Whitney was. She didn't get the global machine behind her like Madonna. And yet, when you really listen, you realize Gwen was part of their sound, part of their time, part of their moment. She just never got the same crown. That's what makes her story so celebrity underrated. Her passing in 1999 at only 48 years old was devastating. Gone too soon, with so much more music left in her. And the fact that the mainstream barely covered it? That's injustice. That's erasure. But her fans, the DJs, the club kids, they never let her fade away. They kept her alive, and today, her legacy is being rediscovered again and again. So let me throw the question out there. Do y'all think Gwen Guthrie deserves to be mentioned in the same breath as icons like Aretha, Chaka Khan, or Stephanie Mills? Should she be considered one of the queens of her era? Or do you think the industry's lack of support defined her place forever? I want to hear from you, because this isn't just my story to tell, it's our story to keep alive. Here's what I know, man. Gwen may not have had all the awards, but she had the truth. She may not have had all the spotlight, but she had the people. And in the end, that's what lasts. Her songs still move bodies on the dance floor, still give people strength, still spark conversations. That's immortality right there. So yeah, Gwen Guthrie might have been underrated, overlooked, and under-celebrated by the business. But in our hearts, in our playlists, in our culture, she's eternal. Rest in power, Queen. Your rent's been paid in full and your voice still lives rent-free in our souls.